Then one cold evening, a sequence of events began that would connect all of those hidden tensions at the exact same moment. A phone call, a meeting that should never have happened, and a decision Daniel Harper would make in a matter of minutes that he would spend the rest of his life unable to take back. And then, the night everything went wrong. The night investigators would later analyze in exact detail began quietly, just like any other evening in Daniel Harper's neighborhood. It was a Thursday in early March, cold enough that most people had already gone inside after sunset. The streets were calm, porch lights glowing softly against the dark sky. Inside his house, Daniel moved through the familiar routine he had followed for years. Dinner, a quick look through emails, and a few phone calls connected to shipments scheduled for the next morning. Nothing about those first hours suggested that this particular night would eventually be discussed in police reports, courtroom testimony, and news coverage across the city. 8:41 p.m. Daniel's phone lights up with an incoming call. The name Travis Cole appears on the screen. According to records later examined by investigators, the call lasted just under 3 minutes. During that conversation, Travis sounded more serious than Daniel had ever heard him before. Travis told him he had recently spoken to someone who mentioned a large shipment of equipment Daniel had arranged privately. Travis repeated the same warning he had sent weeks earlier. If Daniel kept making these deals, the situation could explode in ways neither of them would be able to control. Daniel responded sharply. He told Travis the rumors were exaggerated and that everything was handled. The call ended with Travis saying something investigators would later quote directly during the trial. "You don't understand how close you are to ruining your life." 8:47 p.m. Security footage from a neighbor's home camera shows Daniel's truck pulling out of his driveway. The headlights sweep across the quiet street as he turns toward the main road. Investigators would later confirm that Daniel was heading toward a location just 10 minutes away, a small industrial parking lot where he had arranged to meet a contractor connected to the equipment shipment Travis had been worried about. According to phone data, Daniel had exchanged several messages with that contractor earlier in the evening confirming the meeting time. 8:56 p.m. Daniel arrives at the parking lot behind an equipment storage facility that closes after sunset. The area is mostly empty at night, with only a few security lights illuminating the rows of parked vehicles and stacked materials. A dark pickup truck already sits near the back entrance of the lot. Investigators would later identify the driver as the contractor who had recently purchased the largest shipment Daniel had redirected so far. The plan, according to financial records, involved another delivery that had not yet been entered into the company's system. Daniel believed the meeting would take only a few minutes. 9:05 p.m. Two men stand beside the trucks talking. No cameras capture the conversation, but detectives later reconstructed the exchange using phone records, financial documents, and statements from both men. The contractor begins asking questions about delays connected to previous shipments. Apparently, someone else had started asking about missing equipment. Daniel becomes defensive. He insists everything is under control and that the paperwork will be corrected soon. The contractor, now concerned about his own exposure, pushes for reassurance that the materials cannot be traced back to him. What begins as a business discussion slowly turns into an argument. 9:13 p.m. A resident living in an apartment building across the street later tells police that he heard two men shouting in the parking lot. At the time, he didn't pay much attention. Arguments sometimes happened in that area, especially near the industrial buildings where workers occasionally met after hours. But the raised voices were loud enough that he remembered hearing one man shout a phrase that sounded like, "You told me it was safe." The voices continued for several seconds before fading again into the night. 9:19 p.m. Daniel's phone records show a call placed to Travis Cole. Investigators believe Daniel made the call in the middle of the argument, possibly hoping Travis could help calm the situation or provide advice about how to handle the contractor's concerns. Travis later testified that when he answered the phone, Daniel sounded angry and stressed. He heard another voice in the background speaking loudly. Travis asked Daniel where he was and what was happening. Daniel replied only that things were getting complicated. Travis told him again that the entire arrangement needed to stop before someone got hurt. 9:28 p.m. That phone call would eventually become one of the most important recordings in the case. Travis had placed the call on speaker while working late in his repair shop, which allowed security cameras in the building to capture fragments of the conversation through the audio system. During the recording, investigators later heard Daniel arguing with the contractor about money and missing equipment. The voices grew louder, overlapping each other as the argument escalated. At one point, the contractor accused Daniel of putting him in danger by moving stolen materials through official supply channels. Daniel responded that the contractor had known exactly what he was agreeing to from the beginning. 9:31 p.m. The recording captures a sudden loud sound investigators later identified as a vehicle door slamming. The argument grows more heated. Travis repeatedly asks Daniel what is happening, but his voice becomes harder to hear over the shouting. Then another noise interrupts the conversation. A sharp metallic sound followed by a crash that echoes across the parking lot. The contractor's voice suddenly stops. Daniel's breathing becomes heavy as he speaks into the phone again. 9:33 p.m. For several seconds, nothing but silence fills the recording. Travis calls Daniel's name twice. When Daniel finally answers, his voice sounds completely different from before. Slower, quieter. He tells Travis something has gone wrong. Travis asks what he means, but Daniel doesn't explain. Instead, he says he needs to leave immediately. The line goes dead. 9:35 p.m. A nearby security camera captures Daniel's truck leaving the parking lot at high speed. The headlights disappear down the road within seconds. The contractor's truck remains parked in the same spot where the argument began. 9:42 p.m. Another vehicle enters the parking lot briefly before driving away. The driver later tells investigators he noticed someone lying on the ground near the parked truck, but assumed the person was unconscious after a fight. The driver hesitates for several minutes before deciding to call emergency services. 9:47 p.m. Emergency dispatch receives the call reporting an injured man in the parking lot behind the equipment facility. Police units and medical responders begin moving toward the location. 9:52 p.m. Officers arrive and discover the contractor lying beside his vehicle with severe injuries. The scene immediately suggests that the argument heard earlier had escalated into something far more serious than anyone nearby realized at the time. Detectives would later determine that during the confrontation, Daniel had struck the contractor during the struggle, causing him to fall backward and hit his head against a metal equipment rack positioned near the trucks. And then, everything goes quiet. Within minutes, the parking lot is filled with flashing lights as officers secure the area and paramedics attempt emergency treatment. But the injuries are too severe. By the time police begin collecting witness statements and reviewing nearby security footage, one fact becomes painfully clear to everyone involved in the investigation. By the time police arrived, it was already too late. The investigation began in the early hours of the morning, long before the quiet neighborhood where Daniel Harper lived had fully woken up. By midnight, the parking lot behind the equipment storage facility had been sealed off with police tape. Officers moved carefully through the area, photographing the ground, marking evidence, and speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard the argument that took place earlier that night. The contractor who had been found beside his truck was transported to a nearby hospital, but the injuries were severe. Within hours, investigators confirmed that the confrontation in that parking lot had turned into a fatal incident. What had started as an argument had now become a homicide investigation, and every detail from that evening suddenly carried enormous importance. At first, Daniel Harper was not considered the central focus of the investigation. Detectives initially believed the confrontation might have been connected to disputes within the contractor's own business dealings. The contractor had been involved in several equipment purchases across different counties, and investigators already knew that some of those transactions had raised questions about stolen construction materials. When officers first examined the scene, they focused on identifying everyone who had recently worked with the contractor. Phone records were requested. Financial documents were reviewed. Security cameras from nearby buildings were collected and studied carefully. One of the first breakthroughs came from the same apartment resident who had earlier reported hearing shouting in the parking lot around 9:13 that evening. When detectives interviewed him the following morning, he described hearing two men arguing loudly near the trucks. He could not see their faces clearly, but he remembered the argument sounding intense enough that he briefly considered calling the police before the noise stopped. At the time, he assumed the situation had resolved itself. But once detectives showed him still images from nearby security cameras, He recognized the dark pickup truck that had arrived shortly before the argument began. That truck, investigators soon confirmed, belonged to Daniel Harper. Meanwhile, officers reviewing traffic cameras from nearby intersections noticed that the same pickup truck left the area shortly after the time emergency services were called. The timeline placed Daniel directly at the scene only minutes before the injured contractor was discovered. Detectives decided to visit Daniel's home the following afternoon to ask routine questions about the meeting. When they arrived, Daniel answered the door calmly and agreed to speak with them. According to the initial police report, Daniel appeared cooperative and even seemed willing to help investigators understand what had happened. During that first conversation, Daniel explained that he had arranged to meet the contractor to discuss delivery delays connected to construction equipment shipments. He admitted that an argument had taken place, but insisted the confrontation never became physical. According to Daniel, he had left the parking lot after the contractor became angry and began shouting. Daniel claimed he drove home immediately and had no idea the man had been injured after he left. At first glance, the explanation sounded possible. Arguments between business partners happen frequently, and people sometimes leave heated discussions before realizing the situation has escalated further. But as detectives began comparing Daniel's statement with the evidence collected from the scene, small inconsistencies started appearing. The timeline created from security cameras suggested Daniel remained in the parking lot longer than he had initially described. Phone records also revealed the call Daniel had placed to Travis Cole during the argument. When investigators contacted Travis and asked about the call, they learned something unexpected. Travis had not only spoken with Daniel that night, he had also captured fragments of the conversation through the speaker system in his repair shop. That recording would soon become one of the most important pieces of evidence detectives possessed. When detectives returned to speak with Daniel again, his explanation shifted slightly. This time he admitted that the argument with the contractor had become more heated than he originally described. He said the contractor had accused him of causing serious problems involving equipment shipments. Daniel maintained that the accusations were exaggerated and insisted he left before anything physical occurred. Yet detectives noticed that Daniel's description of the final moments of the argument no longer matched the timeline established through phone records and security footage. The gap between his statements began raising new questions. At the same time, investigators started examining the contractor's financial history and business connections. Several recent purchases of construction equipment appeared unusual. The materials had been delivered quickly through supply channels that normally required longer processing times. When detectives traced the origin of those shipments, they discovered multiple delivery records connected to the logistics department where Daniel Harper worked. Each record contained small adjustments to shipment schedules or inventory classifications that made the equipment appear delayed or rerouted rather than missing. The more detectives reviewed those records, the clearer the pattern became. Equipment was being redirected through the system and sold privately to contractors before the inventory discrepancies could be noticed. The contractor who had died in the parking lot appeared to be one of the individuals receiving those materials. That discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation. What had initially looked like a business argument between two men now appeared connected to a much larger network of questionable equipment transactions. Suddenly, Daniel Harper's role in the story became impossible to ignore. The man who had calmly answered detectives' questions at his front door was no longer simply a witness who happened to be present during an argument. His job position placed him directly in the path of the equipment shipments investigators were already studying. His phone records connected him to the contractor during the exact time the confrontation occurred. And the financial documents detectives had begun reviewing suggested that money had been moving into Daniel's accounts through sources unrelated to his official salary. At first, Daniel Harper wasn't a suspect. But with every new piece of information, that situation began changing rapidly. Detectives built timelines across large whiteboards in the investigation room, connecting shipment records, financial deposits, and phone calls between Daniel and the contractor. The evidence board slowly filled with names, dates, and photographs as investigators reconstructed the final weeks leading up to the confrontation in the parking lot. And right at the center of that growing map of connections appeared the same name again and again: Daniel Harper. Then detectives discovered something shocking in his phone. When detectives obtained a warrant to examine Daniel Harper's phone, they expected to find ordinary business conversations, shipment confirmations, and perhaps a few messages connected to the contractor who had been injured in the parking lot. What they discovered instead was a digital trail that immediately raised new questions about everything Daniel had told them. At first glance, the phone appeared mostly clean. Recent messages looked normal, and several conversations with contractors discussed equipment deliveries in routine language. But forensic analysts rarely stop with what is visible on the screen. Modern phones store fragments of conversations long after users believe those messages have been removed. And once the data extraction process began, investigators started uncovering information Daniel clearly believed had disappeared. Among the recovered data were dozens of deleted messages exchanged between Daniel Harper and the contractor during the weeks leading up to the confrontation. Some of those messages discussed delivery times that never appeared in the official company system. Others mentioned payments for equipment that had been redirected through unofficial channels. The language was cautious but unmistakable. Daniel arranged shipments. The contractor provided cash or private transfers. Each message confirmed the pattern detectives had already suspected when they examined the shipment records. The equipment had not simply been delayed or misplaced. It had been quietly moved through the system by someone who understood exactly how to adjust the paperwork. But one recovered message stood out more than all the others. It was the text Travis Cole had sent Daniel weeks earlier, the same message investigators had already heard about during interviews. The words were still preserved in the phone's archived memory. "Daniel, if you don't stop now, someone is going to get hurt." Detectives studied the timestamp carefully. The message had arrived 3 weeks before the confrontation in the parking lot. For investigators, that sentence suddenly carried enormous weight. It suggested Daniel had been warned about the danger long before the night when everything went wrong. And yet the transactions had continued even after. At the same time detectives were reviewing Daniel's phone, another team was examining security footage from nearby businesses surrounding the industrial parking lot. One camera mounted above a loading dock captured a partial view of the area where Daniel and the contractor had been arguing. The image quality was not perfect, but the recording clearly showed the two men standing beside their trucks shortly after 9 o'clock that night. Investigators watched the footage repeatedly, slowing it frame by frame. The argument between the two men became visible through their body language. Both men were gesturing aggressively, pacing back and forth between the vehicles. Then, just before the timestamp reached 9:31 p.m., the footage revealed the moment detectives had been trying to understand. The contractor stepped closer to Daniel during the argument, pointing toward the truck as if demanding an explanation. Daniel reacted by pushing him away. The push was quick, almost instinctive, but the contractor lost his balance, falling backward against the metal equipment rack positioned behind the vehicles. The impact was sudden and violent. Within seconds, the contractor collapsed onto the pavement. The video did not contain audio, but investigators already had the recording from Travis Cole's repair shop capturing fragments of the same argument. When the two pieces of evidence were synchronized, the timeline became clear. The metallic crash heard during the phone recording matched the exact moment the contractor struck the equipment rack. What had previously been described by Daniel as an argument that ended when he walked away now looked very different. The evidence showed a physical confrontation followed by Daniel leaving the scene immediately afterward. Witness testimony began reinforcing the same sequence of events. The resident who had heard shouting earlier that evening confirmed that the argument sounded intense, with voices raised loudly enough to echo across the parking lot. Another witness who briefly entered the lot before calling emergency services reported seeing someone driving away quickly in a dark pickup truck moments before he noticed the injured man on the ground. When investigators showed that witness a photograph of Daniel's vehicle, he confirmed that it looked identical to the truck he had seen leaving the scene. As detectives assembled these pieces of evidence together, the story Daniel Harper had told them started falling apart. The timeline no longer matched his version of events. The recovered messages showed a clear financial relationship between Daniel and the contractor. The security footage captured the confrontation turning physical. The recording from Travis Cole preserved the moment when the argument escalated beyond control. Each new piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. The incident in the parking lot had not been an unexplained accident between strangers. It was the result of weeks of secret transactions and growing tension that finally erupted that night. The warning Daniel Harper ignored suddenly made perfect sense. When detectives asked Daniel to come in for another interview, the atmosphere inside the interrogation room felt very different from their earlier conversation at his home. This time, investigators already knew far more about what had been happening in the weeks leading up to the confrontation. Daniel sat quietly across the table while detectives placed printed photographs, message transcripts, and shipment records in front of him one by one. At first, he tried to repeat the same explanation he had given earlier. He insisted the contractor had become aggressive during their meeting and that he had left the parking lot before anything serious happened. One detective leaned forward and slid a photograph from the security footage across the table. The image showed Daniel pushing the contractor during the argument. The room fell silent for several seconds as Daniel looked down at the picture. Then the detective spoke calmly. "We know what happened." The words hung in the air as Daniel stared at the evidence spread across the table. For weeks he had believed the arrangement was under control. He believed the shipments were invisible inside the system and the arguments with the contractor were temporary problems that could be managed. But now every piece of that hidden world had been placed directly in front of him. And that was the moment when the entire story collapsed. When the case finally moved into the courtroom months later, the story surrounding Daniel Harper had already spread across local news stations and national headlines. What had begun as a quiet confrontation in a dark parking lot was now being examined under bright lights in front of a packed courtroom filled with reporters, investigators, and families trying to understand how everything had reached this point. The prosecution laid out the timeline slowly, guiding the jury through the weeks leading up to the night of the incident. Shipment records were displayed. Phone logs appeared on large screens. Witness testimony described the argument that echoed across the industrial lot. But the most powerful moment came when prosecutors explained the real motive behind everything that had happened. At the center of the case was not simply a business disagreement. It was the pressure Daniel Harper had created for himself through a series of decisions he believed he could control. The secret shipments had started small, almost harmless in his mind. A few redirected deliveries, a few private payments from contractors looking for faster access to equipment. Each transaction made the next one easier. Each successful deal convinced Daniel he could manage the risk. But over time, the situation grew larger than he realized. Contractors began depending on him. Equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars passed through the system without official documentation. And when questions finally started appearing, the pressure between Daniel and the contractor who died that night reached a breaking point. During the trial, prosecutors also introduced the message Travis Cole had sent weeks earlier. The words were projected onto a screen for the jury to read. "Daniel, if you don't stop now, someone is going to get hurt." Travis himself testified about the conversations he had with Daniel during those final weeks. He explained how he tried repeatedly to convince his old friend to slow down before the situation collapsed. Travis described the uneasy feeling he carried every time another customer mentioned Daniel's name while discussing unusual equipment deals. What he had feared would eventually happened faster than anyone expected. Defense attorneys argued that the confrontation in the parking lot had been an accident. They claimed Daniel had only pushed the contractor during a heated argument and never intended for anyone to be seriously injured. But the prosecution reminded the jury that the confrontation never would have happened if Daniel had stepped away weeks earlier when he first realized the shipments were becoming dangerous. The warning from Travis Cole was not an empty comment made during an argument. It was a genuine attempt to stop Daniel before everything spiraled out of control. Inside the courtroom, Daniel sat quietly through most of the trial, often staring down at the table while witnesses spoke. Members of his family attended several of the hearings, including his sister Melissa, who had once described Daniel as the most dependable person she knew. Watching the evidence unfold in front of her was something she later said felt almost impossible to process. The man being described by investigators, prosecutors, and witnesses no longer sounded like the brother she had grown up with. Instead, he sounded like someone who had slowly convinced himself that rules could be bent just long enough to avoid consequences. The contractor's family also sat in the courtroom throughout the proceedings. For them, the case was not about shipment records or financial transactions. It was about a man who had left home one evening expecting to finish a conversation and never returned. Their statements reminded everyone present that the decisions made during those final weeks had real human consequences far beyond the business arrangement that started everything. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom remained completely silent. After reviewing the evidence, they concluded that Daniel Harper was responsible for the confrontation that led to the contractor's death. The verdict confirmed what investigators had already reconstructed through the evidence. The chain of events began with secret shipments, continued through weeks of arguments and warnings, and ended in a parking lot where a single moment of anger changed several lives forever. In the end, the warning Daniel Harper received weeks earlier was never meant to threaten him. Travis Cole was not trying to scare his friend or accuse him of something unforgivable. He was trying to stop a situation that was already moving toward disaster. The message that appeared on Daniel's phone that night was a chance to walk away before the damage became permanent. A chance to step back, correct the mistakes, and rebuild the life he had spent decades creating. But Daniel Harper ignored that warning. And when the moment finally arrived that forced everything into the open, there was no way left to undo the decisions that had already been made. In the end, the warning wasn't a threat. It was a chance to stop. When the trial ended and the courtroom slowly emptied, the consequences of everything that had happened began settling into place for everyone involved. Daniel Harper stood quietly as the judge delivered the sentence that would define the rest of his life. Years in prison. Years that would be measured not just in time, but in the weight of decisions made during those final weeks when the warnings were still fresh and the outcome had not yet been sealed. As officers escorted him from the courtroom, Daniel briefly turned toward the benches where his sister Melissa had been sitting. The expression on her face carried the same disbelief many people in the room still felt. The dependable brother she had known for decades was now leaving the room as a convicted man. Outside the courthouse, reporters summarized the verdict for viewers who had followed the story since the night police lights first surrounded the industrial parking lot. The details were now clear. A series of secret deals, growing pressure between business partners, a confrontation that escalated in seconds. But behind those facts were the lives that would never return to the quiet normalcy they once had. The contractor's family returned home without the person they expected to see again that evening. Travis Cole returned to his repair shop carrying the memory of the warning he had tried to give his old friend weeks earlier. And Melissa Harper returned to the house, where Daniel once spent weekends laughing with her children. Daniel's home in the quiet Columbus neighborhood soon looked very different from the place neighbors once recognized. The driveway where his truck used to sit each evening remained empty. The front porch light that once turned on automatically at sunset now illuminated a house where no one came or went. People walking past sometimes slowed their steps, remembering the flashing police cars that had appeared there months earlier when the investigation first reached Daniel's door. The neighborhood eventually returned to its familiar routines, but the house itself remained a quiet reminder of how quickly an ordinary life can disappear. Inside prison walls, Daniel Harper would have more time than he ever expected to think about the decisions that led him there. The shipments that seemed small at the beginning, the arguments he dismissed as temporary problems, and the message that appeared on his phone weeks before everything collapsed. A single sentence from Travis Cole that had tried to stop the situation before anyone was hurt. In the silence of those long years, that sentence would likely echo louder than anything else connected to the case. Because sometimes the moment that changes your life forever is not the moment when everything finally breaks apart. Sometimes it happens earlier, when someone offers a warning that still leaves time to turn around. A moment when the future has not yet been decided and the path forward can still be changed. Sometimes the moment that changes your life forever is the moment you choose not to listen. Daniel Harper's story is difficult to forget because it forces a question many people rarely ask themselves. Looking back now, the warning signs seem clear. The message from Travis Cole, the growing tension between business partners, the quiet decisions that slowly pulled Daniel further away from the life he had spent years building. But when you are standing inside those moments, when the consequences still feel distant and the choices appear manageable, recognizing those warning signs is not always as easy as it seems. Daniel believed he could control the situation. He believed the problems could be corrected later. And by the time he realized how far everything had moved beyond his control, the damage had already been done. So here's the question. If you were in his position, would you have seen the warning signs? Would you have stepped back when Travis Cole sent that message, realizing that one decision could prevent everything that followed? Or would you have done the same thing Daniel Harper did and convinced yourself that the situation was still under control? Stories like this leave us with uncomfortable questions because they remind us how small choices can quietly build into life-changing consequences. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more real stories where one decision changes everything, subscribe.